My name is Alice Chotard, and I'll be hosting this conversation today with Savannah Dodd. This seminar is part of a series that my colleague Catherine Gresham and I are running as part of the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, and it's on development and photography ethics. So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure that you're joining us from all sorts of places. And it's my pleasure to host today Savannah Dodd, who's the founder and director of the Photography Ethics Centre based in Belfast. And we'll be talking about why we need photography ethics these days. We all know that images are on the rise in international development and humanitarian sector, used by NGOs, by the media agencies, and increasingly so by research. And we know instinctively that photography is a powerful tool, but less often do we reflect on the ethics of photography, and that's what we'll be discussing today with Savannah. And just a little note of caveat before we start. Is that there's lots of different types of ethical issues we can discuss with photography, whether we're talking about representation, consent, editing images, sharing images, power, and much more. And for this conversation, we'll be mostly focusing on issues of representation and stereotypes. Some of our previous conversation focused on other topics, and also this conversation we'll have half an hour of conversation, half an hour of Q&A. So if you have any questions relating to other types of ethical issues, please, by all means, you'll have half an hour of Q&A with Savannah, and she's the expert on the topic. So do ask any question you have in the chat box. So we've pre-recorded this conversation to avoid internet issues. So I'll now be sharing the video, but before that, I want to introduce Savannah. So Savannah is an anthropologist and a photographer based in Belfast. She founded the Photography Ethics Centre in 2017 with the aim of raising awareness about the ethics of taking and sharing photographs and other visual media. She has an MA in anthropology and sociology from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva, and she's currently pursuing a PhD in anthropology at Queen's University Belfast, where she's examining the ethics of archiving photographs of civil conflict in post-conflict societies. Prior to founding the center, she worked in the development sector for NGOs and IGOs in Switzerland, Uganda, and Thailand. Alongside her work with the center, she undertakes independent photography project. So wonderful to have you, Savannah. I will now share the video. So if you bear with me a second.
Good.
So hello, Savannah. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Yes, really well. Thanks for joining us for this talk.
Thanks.
So
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. I'm going to dive in. So you founded the Photo Ethics Center in 2017 to raise awareness about the ethics of taking and sharing photographs and other media. And photo ethics is also a term we're starting to hear more and more. And so to start, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, what we mean by photography ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important at the outset to say, like, there are ethics that we can consider at every stage in the process, right? From when we're deciding what to photograph, how we photograph it, how we edit a photograph, where we publish a photograph, and how we caption it. I think at every sort of stage in this process, there are definitely different ethical decisions that we're making. All the time, right? Every time we take or share a photograph, there are ethical decisions that we are making. And we might not always be aware that we are making ethical decisions in those moments. So I think a lot of the work that I do with the Photography Ethics Center is really trying to raise awareness about what are those moments when we're making decisions? What are those moments when decisions are made? Because if we can be aware of those moments, I think we can take a little bit more ownership over the decisions that we're making and be a little bit more deliberate in that decision-making process. And I really cast the net of what I consider ethics, or what falls within the scope of ethics, very broadly. I think that ethics relates to, of course, the processes of actually producing images and sharing images, but also, how we conduct ourselves with our colleagues, how we conduct ourselves with the people that we're photographing, also self-care and personal safety. I think all of these things are really, there are ethical dimensions and ethical elements to really all of these aspects. So it's quite a wide scope of what sort of I think constitutes ethics.
And you have an anthropology background, don't you? I'm curious to know how that has shaped your understanding of photography ethics. Because photography ethics, my understanding is that it's sort of ever evolving term, and yeah.
Well, I think that the thing is really that when I first started to sort of really actively get involved in the photography industry, I started, volunteering at galleries and photography festivals. And I was fresh out of a master's program in the anthropology and sociology of development. And I think in anthropology rather, we talk a lot about informed consent. We talk about the ethics of how we negotiate access into and out of communities, and we talk a lot about the responsibility to consider the impact of our work. So when I showed up at these festivals and exhibitions, I was wanting to have these conversations, right? I was bringing up a lot of questions about, how do you get access? How do you get consent? What does that look like in your practice? And I realized that these are really skills that I gained from anthropology, but that not everybody has access to that set of skills, and not everybody is thinking about this in their own work. And I guess that really it just really informed my own practice as a photographer. And I guess I'm trying to make those skills that I gained from anthropology sort of really just about critical thinking and reflexivity, and translate those into a way that's applicable for people who are working with photography who might not have the same background.
It's always very valuable when disciplines cross and you can learn something from the other discipline. So I now want to zoom out a little bit, move out, from focusing on photography ethics. And I want to ask you a question about the role that photography plays in documenting international development and humanitarian issues. And, the use of photographs is on the rise in journalism, through NGO work, and even in research. And I wonder, why that is, and do you think that photography is a powerful tool to document these issues?
Absolutely. I think photography is definitely a powerful tool. I almost want to back up and talk about, what a photograph is, first, if that's okay, and how it functions, because I think that that's really important to understanding, one, why photography ethics matter, and two, why photography is so powerful. So if you'll allow me a slight divergence, if that's okay. But I think that the thing about photography is that when we see a photograph, we understand that the thing that's pictured was actually there, right? And that has to do with that indexical physical relationship between the way that photographs were traditionally made through an analog camera and the relationship that has to reality, right? And so people, when we see photographs, we understand it as that is something that relates to reality, that has a direct relationship to the world around us. And so when we look at photographs, it means that really photographs shape how we see the world, right? And so when we're taking and sharing photographs, we're having an active role in how others see the world and how others understand the world. And so I think that that's really important to understand if we're going to think about the power of photography. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, if we're helping people to understand the world around us, that is a tremendous tool if we're going to talk about social issues, of course. I think that we all have seen examples, in the news of, how photography can be really responsible for promoting empathy and compassion. And it can influence policy. I think that we've seen, whole tides of public opinion change based on photographs that we've consumed. And I think that the thing that really becomes universal, well, it can also do the opposite, right? It can also photography, I think, can also at times stoke discrimination and prejudice as well. But the thing that I think is universal in that is that photographs have such power to shape our consciousness of an issue. And so done well, I think photography can be an absolute superpower for good, but done poorly, I think it can do a lot of damage. I don't know if that answered your question. Did that sort of get at your question?
Yes, no, and it's interesting because I think instinctively, a lot of us know that photographs are powerful, but sometimes it's quite tricky to really pinpoint why that is. And but I agree that they're very much shaping our understanding of the world, and also how we're reacting towards other people. And so you mentioned, the two sides of the picture. On the one hand, it's can have a positive impact, and on the other hand, it can have a negative impact. And I'd like now to go in that direction and ask you maybe more specifically how images can be problematic, and especially when we think about the field of international development. And I think oftentimes, the intentions are good, the intentions to raise awareness about certain issues, but we're not necessarily aware about how, certain representations can be damaging. And I wonder if you can expand a little bit on that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. That yeah, yeah, and that's something that I've said a lot with my work with the Photography Ethics Center. I think the majority of the time people aren't setting out with malice. They're not intending to be unethical in how they're using images. It's just I think that there's a general lack of awareness about how photography ethics functions and how we can be more ethical as photographers. But I guess if we're thinking about sort of the risks of photography in international development, I think on one hand you have really obvious things maybe around informed consent and image usage and identifiability, especially because photographs capture extraneous data that wouldn't be captured in a drawing, right? So it makes any risks if you're trying to anonymize somebody, it makes that all much more complicated and requires a lot more thinking through possible impacts. But I think beyond that, I think that there's really a greater responsibility to recognize that we're actively contributing to sort of the visual landscape of a subject, right? So this is a really mundane example, but if we take a photograph of a beach in Ireland and we share that to social media, we are adding another point of reference for people about what is a beach in Ireland. And that's maybe really straightforward, but I think that we're often not conscious of this representational power that we have when we're taking and sharing images. And the beach example is really innocuous, right? And we might not need to be so self-critical or so reflexive about something like that. But then there are other things that can perpetuate really harmful stereotypes. And by adding more photographs that perpetuate more stereotypes, we are reifying that stereotype in the visual landscape. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, do you have any examples of these sorts of stereotypes?
I mean, it's one of those things I almost hate to name them because I think we all know them. I think I think maybe, obviously, things like people who are, children who are portrayed in dirty or tattered clothing, or people being, portrayed as sort of passive recipients of aid. But I think that one of the hard things about stereotypes is that they're so embedded in many people's ways of seeing the world, and all of our ways of seeing the world, really, so much so that I think unless we are actively setting out to be reflexive and to be conscious, I think it can be very easily missed and just sort of wrapped up in our assumptions. I'm not really articulating that terribly well, but maybe I can unpack it as we go on a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, often what I think with international development photography, and what is really difficult is, we want to highlight inequalities and, poverty issues, but doing that in a way that doesn't take the agency away from the people we photograph. is quite difficult because you don't want to manipulate the images too much. But at the same time, it's about, the message that it carries. It's the people who are in the photographs are always passive victims, and that can be problematic. I feel sometimes. I don't know what you think about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that's sort of one of the things that I think people really struggle with is, this understanding that, can creating more images that reproduce stereotypes is not helpful. We're not going to nobody's going to learn anything new from that, right? We've all seen that before. The world doesn't need more stereotypical images. Um, but absolutely, like, it's not to say that the stereotype doesn't exist, right? The stereotype is there, like that there is poverty in many of the places that we're working in, in international development, for example. But there's more to the story. That isn't all that's there. And I think that our current photographic record doesn't really reflect that. It reflects a very single story. I always reference Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of a single story, which is fantastic. If you haven't seen it, go see it. But yeah, and I think that she's talking more about literature, I think, in that TED Talk, but it's so applicable if we're thinking about photography.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, having just one image versus having a compilation of images, or really accompanying an image with text that explains, I think that makes the whole difference. One image on its own can be problematic because that's just one way of seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there are ways of using a single image and creating a single image that also is rooted in dignity and doesn't rely on stereotypes. But absolutely, I think you're right that it's much easier to tell a much fuller story when you have the luxury of being able to include more photographs.
So what are some of the elements of a good, photograph that respects the dignity of the people who are photographed?
Well, I think that there are many things. I think one of the really really important things, and I might sound like I'm absolutely just rambling on about stereotypes, but I do think being really conscious and aware of stereotypes is really important, because not just because they're replicating a very one-sided view of the world, and that's not terribly helpful, but also because I think that photographs that rely on stereotypes tend to lack dignity for the individuals and the image. Photographs that are very stereotypical and very reliant on tropes often rely on the individuals in the image to be props, as opposed to actual individuals with their own life and desires and hopes and dreams. You get a very one-dimensional perspective, I think, on individuals in photographs, in very stereotypical images. So I think trying to tell more complex stories is really, really important to dignity. I think, stories that aren't invoking tropes and stereotypes. And I think one way to sort of check ourselves on that is really to ask yourself, how is this image communicating, right? What is it saying? What will people learn from this image? And if they don't learn anything new, chances are you might need to check out your stereotypes and see, what kind of tropes you're invoking in that image. But visual language is a massive part of this, and I think that everybody should really cultivate a stronger understanding of how images communicate.
Yes, and visual language, maybe just to clarify for the audience, I mean, if that's what I'm understanding you're referring to, is the choices we make, such as, having a photo in color versus black and white, or the angle that you take the photograph at, and all these kind of technical choices. I wonder if you can expand a little bit on that and how those visual, choices, the choices of visual language, how that can reinforce potentially those stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times we think about aesthetic choices as just being aesthetic, right? Just being stylistic. But aesthetic choices communicate a lot of meaning. And exactly like you said, the choice of putting a photograph in black and white conveys a certain meaning to the viewer who then it reads and interprets that image. A lot of times black and white photographs will remind people of, historical photographs. When we see things that were further away in history, they tend to be in black and white because Kodachrome was invented much later. And also I think, it's almost a signal to the brain that this is something outside of my normal everyday experience. So I think black and white photography at times can have an othering effect, which might not matter. That might be totally fine in some instances. But if you're creating work about maybe marginalized communities, maybe you don't want to invoke visual language that might be othering. So it's things like that to really be conscious of. And like you said, the top-down perspective can really communicate a power imbalance. And so being aware of what choices am I making and what is that communicating? Because all of these aesthetic decisions as well, and visual language is rooted in visual culture. There is a precedent that we're building on when we invoke stylistic choices. So I think it's also really important to understand, where do those aesthetic conventions come from, right? Especially because many of the conventions that are often invoked in international development photography really come from like a very colonialist worldview. So I think it's really important to interrogate, what are the roots of the stylistic choices that I'm choosing, right? Is that communicating what I'm wanting to communicate? Because I think that sometimes we can invoke language that does not put forward the meaning that we're wanting to put forward, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. When I think about what's inspired me when I was younger, the kinds of images that inspired me, well, my parents had lots of National Geographic. My dad had a subscription to National Geographic, especially those early National Geographic. And also, I at the time we had books from Sebastián Salgado, which are often in black and white, and those are images that I found really powerful. But I think now a lot of those images would be considered problematic. And I think if you grow up seeing those kinds of images, you're also more likely to replicate. And it's important to have more of a diversity of images now.
Absolutely. I think that we a lot of times replicate the tropes that we think are good, right? Or even the subject matter. We've seen so many photographs of children in low and middle income countries in not terribly dignified and very impoverished conditions that doesn't really communicate anything, but we see that and we think, oh, that's a good image, right? Because we've seen so much of it. And I think that there's that sort of reinforcement that comes a lot of times. And I think that we can replicate those things, without developing that awareness. And I think that that's really dangerous.
Yeah. We were talking about aesthetics a little bit, and I'm curious to know what you think about whether it's okay to have a beautiful image, to create a beautiful image of suffering or of vulnerability or poverty.
That's a really good question.
And I
It's a
guess
really tough
beauty is
question.
it's beauty is subjective. I guess it depends, what we mean by beauty.
Yeah. I think Susie Linfield talks about this in a really interesting way in her book, The Cruel Radiance.
Mhm.
I don't want to get that title wrong, but definitely check it out if you're interested in this topic, because she says something in it that really, really struck me about how, I don't want to quote it wrong, but it's something about how we often think that it's okay to look at suffering if it's sloppily constructed, as if that somehow absolves us of viewer responsibility, and how that does more to make the viewer comfortable than anything else. And that shouldn't be necessarily the objective. Well, the viewer and the photographer, I guess, comfortable. And yeah, this idea that hastily created images are more acceptable. And yeah, I found that really interesting and kind of challenging, but I am still, I guess, processing on a personal level, sort of what I think about that. But I guess in terms of ethically, I think it's maybe more important what the image is communicating beyond whether it's attractive or not attractive. What other things are happening in that image to tell a story about the people who are portrayed. Because I think that really beautiful images can communicate nothing, and really, at times, and really sloppy images can communicate so much more nuance and depth. and the other way around. So I don't know that I would use the charge of asceticism against images of suffering, if that makes any sense.
Yes, no, that's a great answer. You talked a little bit about truth earlier, and I want to dive in a little bit more about that. So in journalism, in international development work and research, we have this drive to tell the truth. And I want to hear more what your thoughts are on photography and objectivity, which I know is a huge topic.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a very false perception that photography is objective. I think it's really rooted in sort of what I was saying earlier about what a photograph is and how we interpret a photograph. I think that that idea of indexicality, of a photograph being a direct trace of reality has really impacted how we understand photographic truth. And I think it's really important to unpack that when we're thinking about objectivity. Because I think historically that's been used to say, right, it's a direct physical trace on a from light bouncing onto a photosensitive surface, and therefore it's true. But that really negates the role of the person, right, who's lifting the camera and making a myriad of subjective choices throughout that process. And those subjective choices are really influenced by our positionality, right? Like we all have our own worldview. We all see the world through our own lens. We cannot ever shed that to be fully objective. And I think that that is a really important thing for everybody to recognize. Because I think that we can only, if our objective is to come as close as we can to truth, we have to first recognize our subjectivity, right? We have to recognize what is my positionality, what are my assumptions, and we need to be able to account for that, I think, when we're making work. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I remember I went to a talk a couple of years back with a photographer, and actually I can't remember his name, but he was sharing some of his images, and he stopped at some point and he said, well, what I really like about photography is the subjectivity, is how everyone can interpret an image in a different way. And that kind of stuck with me because, if that is the case, then what is the role of photography, especially when we're using it for, journalism, international development. Yeah, especially if there isn't one single truth, I wonder what your thoughts are about how we can use photography for international development work, if there isn't that single objectivity.
I think I think there are many ways to answer that question, and I think it's a very good question. And I think it's also kind of a hard question, because I think that there are many truths. I don't think we can expect photography to do all the heavy lifting of telling the truth about the world, right? And I think that there's a lot of value in showing all of the, as many truths as we can through images, and sort of, I guess, like I said earlier, not replicating the expected, but showing other things that maybe are unexpected or underrepresented about contexts that we're working in. And I think that photography really is so unique in that it can really provide people with access to other perspectives and to things that they wouldn't be able to access themselves. And I think that's also really why we need a variety of image makers from a diversity of backgrounds, right? I think, if we're thinking about positionality and we're thinking about truths and we're thinking about who's telling the stories, right? That's going to be a massive part of this. And so I think it's really important to think very carefully about who are we hiring to tell these stories, right? What photographers are we using? And how is their positionality going to influence the images that they make? And how can we expand, right, the visual record by taking other images, but also using other image makers?
Yeah, and something you said earlier, I mean, I fully agree. Something you said earlier is really about asking ourselves, the hard questions, or not necessarily the hard question, but really asking ourselves, what is this image going to add? What am I documenting? Why am I doing it? And so it takes a lot of, doing a lot of research to understand why we're understanding the situation. Yeah, so I really take your point on that. I think I can see the clock ticking, so I'll probably start to wrap up. I wonder if you could share, say, three practical recommendations for anyone who takes or uses images in international development.
Yeah, that's another good and hard question. But I think the first thing that I would say actually relates really directly to what you were just saying about developing understanding and doing research, right? I think part of that needs to be about getting a really good grasp on visual language. Spend time looking at photographs, both current photographs and historical photographs, and learn more about the history of photography, the historical legacy of like colonialism and international development and the context that you're working in, and how these all come together in, to create the context in which you're creating and sharing images. I think that's really important to both better understand the ethics of image production, but also to understand how viewers are going to read and interpret your images. Yeah, I think probably maybe a second thing would be to really develop a clear awareness about power in your work. I think that power is something that we haven't really talked much about. Well, we talked a bit about, but I think it could be impacted a whole lot further. And I think it requires a lot of soul searching and a lot of reflexivity and a lot of hard work, really, to maybe step back and think about, you know, who am I in this context, and how am I operating, and what's my place in this power dynamic, right? And I think that relates to, yeah, having a really good understanding of informed consent, because informed consent, right, part of that is that people have to feel able to say no, and that can be very hard with the power dynamics. Just a side note, whenever we talk about informed consent, I do feel like it's very necessary to add the reminder that informed consent is not the same thing as a consent form. Those are two different things, and I just feel like I always have to make that caveat when we bring up informed consent. But lastly, I think the third maybe recommendation I might have would be to really improve communication about photography across organizations and across the people who are involved in that process. I think when I've spoken with some NGOs and charities, it seems like there can often be a disconnect in how people understand photography and photography ethics across different branches of an organization, but also, having really good and robust conversations with the image makers as well. I think image makers a lot of times feel like they are under pressure. They aren't given the time that they need to produce work in a really robustly ethical way. So I think having more of these conversations, establishing more consensus with the people that you're working with is just vital. I think anything that we can do to promote these conversations is really necessary.
Yeah. So to recap, more conversations, more questions, more communication, and more diving into what our intentions are. And I really appreciate that you brought up informed consent. That's something we didn't talk about really today, but it's such a huge topic, and often in these seminars there's always questions about that. So if people have questions in the audience, then Savannah's the right person to ask.
And I'm happy to answer any questions.
And I also want to say, as I'm wrapping up, that you really provide a lot of great material and courses through the Photo Ethics Center. Maybe to close, you can explain to us, what the Photo Ethics Center does, and the kinds of offering that you provide to different audiences.
Yeah, so the Photography Ethics Center is really all about education. It's all about promoting a deeper understanding of ethical literacy among people who take and share photographs. So we do that through a wide variety of activities. We have a podcast called the Photo Ethics Podcast. We have self-paced online courses that are available online. I also design and facilitate workshops and guest lecture at different places and write articles. We wear many hats and we do many activities, but it's really all about trying to create more opportunities to make that kind of education accessible to people in all sorts of formats. Yeah, I don't know if I answered that question
Yes,
terribly well, but definitely check out our website because I think it probably explains it a bit better than I just did. So
no, definitely. And I mean, it has really helped my own personal, understanding and thinking of photo ethics. So I really encourage anyone, and you're active on Twitter and Instagram as well, if anyone uses this media.
that's always great to hear. So thanks very, very much. I'm glad to hear it's been beneficial for people for sure.
Yeah. So thanks, Savannah, for this conversation. We're now moving into the Q&A, and I can see there's already quite a few questions. I find these Q&As are always very interactive. So I'll go for it. I'll start with Verity, who asked the first question about how we take this discussion around stereotypes in photography and expand that to the people and organizations who are commissioning images. And I think it's a really important question because photo ethics shouldn't be just a responsibility of photographers. I think it's very important that those who commission images ask themselves these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think, like you just said, Alice, like photographers aren't working in a vacuum, right? It's part of this very collaborative and very multi-layered relationship, right? I think that's a great question, Verity. So thank you very much for asking that. I think one thing is to, first of all, just have these conversations. But I think another part of it is really about actually shifting how we think about work and development as well, right? I think somebody later on talks about language, and I think we can think about the language that we use in the international development industry as well. It can be quite harmful, and I think it can really betray people's framing of how we view that work. And I think that if we're viewing work in the development sector in a certain way, I think that or in a very colonialist or sort of white savior way, I think that will come through in the images that we take and the images that we choose to share. So I think that this is definitely a conversation that needs to be had across organizations and at multiple levels. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Did I sort of get at that?
I'm not the one who asked the question, but maybe Verity can follow up in the comments if you have any follow-up questions. Yeah. I'll take a question from Gail now, about whether you have any examples of photographs that promote stereotype and those that do not. So I guess this is pointing to maybe a few more specific examples that you can give.
Yeah, I think photos that don't promote stereotypes a lot of times are ones where people are active. I think that a lot of times images where people are passive, where maybe they're holding something that has been gifted, or just it doesn't, we're not learning, we don't know anything about them, right? And so I think images maybe where people are shown to be passive agents for change in their own communities, I think that is an example of a type of image where we learn something a little bit beyond our expectations or assumptions about a context. That's obviously just one example. There are loads, there's loads to unpack. But I think that's maybe a big one that I think is also beginning to gain more traction as well in how we think about international development. Yeah.
And maybe to add as well, images of refugees can be quite stereotypical as well sometimes, and maybe images of women sometimes as sort of being victims. I think it very much depends, but it can be. And children, I think you mentioned in the talk as well.
And as well, I remember when I was working for an organization, I was told, don't photograph any children with mobile phones, right? Because people don't expect them to have mobile phones, and they live in insecure housing environments. And so people don't want to see that they have phones. But I think, the reality is they have phones. Doesn't mean they have healthcare. It doesn't mean that they have secure housing. It doesn't mean that they have sanitation, right? Services. So I think also recognizing that poverty doesn't look just one way, and showing that there isn't sort of one way to be in a socially deprived environment. Does that make sense?
So our next question is anonymous. It's actually not really a question, but I'll turn it into a question. So it says ethics should not just be about combating stereotypes. And I think we both agree with that. I think this conversation was more focusing on stereotypes, but there's obviously other types of ethical issues. I would have liked to see from examples with images. Anthropology and photography have a linked history, which is filled with the ethics of colonialism. This should be acknowledged. And I know, Savannah, you've written on this before. Maybe you can talk about the links between photography and colonialism in that era.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are loads. I think that photography really functioned to validate the colonial project in a lot of ways, and sort of when it was first really gaining traction. I mean, I think that there are so many ways we could think about this, and I struggle to speak off the cuff on it because it is a very rich and very in-depth history that does need some serious and very careful unpacking. And I think that it has led to a lot of very internalized ways of seeing the world, because we've come to understand a lot of places through sort of the colonial record in many contexts. And I see as well, this Zoom user also said that, meanings have changed. And absolutely, I think that's a really important point as well. And I think that that's something that has been very interesting. If you look at the work of like Elizabeth Edwards, for example, who she talks a lot about how photographs from anthropology, when it was very much being used to validate colonialism and imperialism, how those photographs then came to be reinterpreted and to be understood, to understand and deconstruct colonialism instead of creating typologies that were very much racist and based in sort of things like not anthropomorphism. That's not the word I'm looking for. I can't remember the word, it'll come to me. But yes, so I mean, and yes, absolutely, like ethics isn't just about stereotypes, but I do think that there's immense value in talking about visual language, because I think it's one area of ethics that is not discussed in terms of ethics enough. I think we talk a lot about consent, we talk a lot about other things, and that's super important. We should definitely be talking about those things. But I think there's a lot of value in understanding visual language too.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Really interesting question from David. If we're talking about photography, we should interrogate the words we use to describe the act of doing it. And he's referring to words such as capturing and shooting subjects. Can you speak to how this vocabulary relates to photography ethics? Absolutely. I think that it reflects a lot of how maybe photography used to be viewed more in terms of being quite extractive. And I think that, being very careful about how we view ourselves as image makers and, how we describe our work. Like, again, with language, I think language really shows a lot how we're relating to our work. And I think, I mean, we didn't talk about it in this talk, but I think that there's like a lot that could be said about collaboration, right? And those types of words definitely don't speak to a collaborative process. I'm not the best placed person probably to talk about collaboration. I think a lot of other people speak very well about it and draw on their own practice of sort of collaborative storytelling. So I don't want to get too deep into that, but I think really, if we think about any time we're making images, I think it should be in some way collaborative, right? In some way based around a conversation, around an exchange of ideas and thoughts. And so I think that those words of capturing or shooting are not at all reflecting or reflective of a collaborative or in any way empathetic process. Yeah, it's very interesting to observe how the language we use for things very much shapes the approach that has been historically been used. Next question is on the use of caption. which is quite interesting. So Oxfam's recent ethical guidelines reference the importance of caption. Do people in this group agree? Is it essential to use captions which share specific information on context to avoid the perpetuation of specific visual stereotypes, with the caveat of not putting anyone at risk by sharing location information, etc. in the caption? Is it ever okay for us to use images without caption?
I think that's another really interesting question, and absolutely. Yeah, I think captions are extremely important. However, I also think that, especially when things are going online, I think we need to recognize that there's a possibility of things being removed from their caption. So I would say that I think that the way that we put an image out there, we need to understand how it will stand alone as well, right? How it will be read if there is no caption with it, because that's always a risk, right? Anytime we publish something online, there's a massive risk that it can be separated from its caption or misappropriated. So I think that, yes, I think captioning is extremely important. And I think we could do a whole nother talk about captioning and what that, how that works and how that functions. I don't know. I don't know if I definitely don't have a clear answer on whether or not it's ever okay to use images without captions. I think that I rarely come down hard as never on anything, because I think that, it really depends on the situation and the context and what the image is and where it's going, to be able to say whether it is ever okay. Yeah, so captions are very important though, and absolutely, I think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that.
And around the same theme of interpretation, really interesting and quite difficult question, which I think links to some of the topics we covered in the talk, but dives in a little bit more. If a photograph is subjective and will be interpreted differently by different people in different contexts, to what extent can or should the photographer and others involved in the publishing of photographs be responsible for how it is interpreted? Should the responsibility fall on the audience as well?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just rereading it here because I hadn't scrolled down that far yet. 2 seconds. Yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely. I think that responsibility is also with viewers. I think responsibility is also with photographers. I think responsibility is also with the people who are selecting and publishing images. I think that, everybody in that process definitely has, carries some responsibility in that. I think audience or viewer responsibility is very interesting and is very important. I think that we're all still learning how to be ethical viewers of images. And I think that's something that Susie Linfield talks about a bit in her book as well. What does it mean when we look at images of trauma, and how can we look at images of trauma ethically as well? And how can we understand them? So yes, I think we all have a responsibility in this process. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of times as well, photographers seem to bear the brunt sometimes of sort of ethical breaches or issues. But I think it's an industry-wide issue, really. It's not, any people are producing work within a system, right? And I think that everyone in that system has their own role to play. I thought you were going to ask the question also by Verity there as well about, is photography the best medium? Can I jump to that one really quick? Is that okay, Alice? Sorry. Because I think that's also a really great question as well. Verity asks, is photography the best medium, to tell this story in certain instances? And this is something that I think is really interesting, because I think that when we are using photography, photography is a medium, as I said, in the talk there, that is linked to this idea of indexicality in a way that other visual media are not photography and film, both are, have this indexical relationship with reality. So I think that whenever we are taking and sharing photographs, we are in some way making a truth claim. It will be viewed in some way as corresponding to truth. And I think, when we're choosing to use photography, I think that's something that's really important to remember, because I think that is what gives photography that added layer of responsibility in my view. Yes. Sorry for that detour, Alice.
No, and I was going to say it's yet another reason to also educate the public about what photography is and how to interpret photography.
Absolutely.
So I'm trying to get back to where we were with the question. Actually, a comment from David, and he says that also, the word we use, subject, is quite telling.
Yeah.
The word like contributors or sources. There's lots of different ways we can change the language, and I think that's a really interesting point.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions, but I will jump into Catherine's question, but let me know if I miss any previous ones. So that's a question on capturing images of children. Oftentimes researchers are told to not take any photos of children as a standard ethical practice. However, how ethical is it to exclude an entire demographic from images in order to avoid engaging with the difficult questions around the ethics of photographing children? Do you have any key ethical principles for including children in images? Who gives consent, the child, the parent? When is it okay? How to photograph children?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you're thinking about consent, I think absolutely it's important to have a parent or guardian's consent. But I also think sometimes we think, oh, well, we have the parent or guardian's consent and that's enough. And I think that, we also need to recognize that children also have, the right to autonomy. They also have the right to say yes or no. And I think that that's definitely not a step to be missed. If children are not interested or willing to be active participants, a parent's consent for photography, would not be enough in that instance. Yeah, and when is it okay, and how to photograph children? I mean, I think that it all really depends on the context, right, that we're working in. I think that there are a load of considerations to think about as well when it comes to time limitations on, if we use photographs of children, how long do we use them for, right? And where do they go? If that child is going to grow up and be a young adult and be looking for a job, should it still be online? Should we link them eternally to that image of themselves as a child? So I think that there are a load of questions to ask about that. I think there's quite a good article on Witness, World Press Photos platform, called Through a Glass Darkly, I believe it is. I think Jason Tanner is here. I believe he was involved in the writing of that. And that's quite a good resource to think about informed consent in children and the rights of the child. And I think it's a really great starting point for anybody who is interested in thinking more about working with children in an ethical and dignified way.
Great. I don't know if Jason is still here. Feel free to post it in the chat box. I'm sure many people will find that useful. So consent was part of this question, and that's always a question that we get asked in Q&A. Usually, I'm surprised it didn't come up. You, in your talk, you mentioned the difference between informed consent and consent forms. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times there is a frustration. I've seen this a bit, I guess, where there's been a bit of a frustration about consent forms, which is totally understandable, because sometimes we are given consent forms that are not practical, right? So on one hand, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, yes, sometimes consent forms are dense, sometimes they're laborious. When we're given consent forms and we have no control over the creation of those consent forms, but we have to use those consent forms, it can be very frustrating. But a consent form at the end of the day is proof of consent, but that isn't the consent process. Informed consent needs to happen first. So informed consent is actually the process of consent, right? It's making sure that people understand where their images are going, how they're going to be used, the purpose of them being used, making sure that people feel able to say no, right? And obviously consent isn't consent if people don't know what they're consenting to, right? Consenting to have your photograph on a billboard is very different from having your photograph in an annual report. So I think really trying to work with people to make sure that they understand, where is this going? What is the potential reach? Why are you using their photograph? That's all part of that informed consent process. The consent form is part of that. It's the evidence, right? It's the evidence that that conversation has been had. There is a problem a lot of times in many organizations with consent forms, that they are very legalistic, that they're too long, that they're not in the language of the people that we're working with. And I think all those things can be unpacked with, much better conversations, right? Between the people on the ground, the photographers, the people who are doing the process of storytelling, and maybe the people who are in charge of those processes in organizational headquarters or what have you. I think that there's a communication disconnect sometimes, and I think that making sure that the processes that we're using are effective and appropriate is essential. I don't know if did I answer your question there? Is that a little bit more clear?
I think that was great. Yeah, thank you. And that also made me think whether we should include, as part of the informed consent seeking process, whether we should explain what exactly how the message of the image might be interpreted, what we're doing to make sure that an image isn't going to be stereotypical, what are the kinds of stereotypes in this field. I wonder if you have any experience of making that clear to the people who are photographed.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that is having a conversation with people as well to see how do they want to be portrayed, right? What's important to them, what messages are important to them that are conveyed to the viewer. Who is the viewer, right? Is it people in globally? Is it a certain country? I think relating to this as well is something that I think I try to talk with people about a lot, is this idea of maybe multi-layered consent. So understanding that, a blanket consent, which is a lot of times what consent forms are designed to do. They're designed for consent to use an image in whatever way the organization wishes in perpetuity, right? That does not give very much choice to the people that we're working with. So I think that maybe one way of giving people a little bit more control over their image is to invite them to put parameters, right? To say, I'm totally fine with you using this image for 5 years, but after that, I'd really like you to stop using it. Or feel free to use this image, but I don't want people in my community to see it, which of course, if people don't want people in their own community to see it, then that means maybe it can't go online, because online doesn't have geographic restrictions. So I think there are many ways that we can maybe bring a little bit more nuance to this process of consent, and to give people a little bit more choice in how their images are going to be used, and really bring their preferences into the process. I think it's really important.
And I think you answered already one of the last questions we have from Zoom user. Didn't specify the name. But if you have any further question, do let us know. We're on the hour, so any final questions, please feel free to share it. I don't want to go too much over time. Maybe one wrapping up question for me, Savannah, is how you've seen the field of photography ethics evolve, ever since you've been asking yourself these questions.
Yeah, I think it's evolved tremendously. I think, you know, when I first founded the center in 2017, I don't think that many people wanted to have these conversations with me. I think that, you know, it was not a terribly popular thing to be talking about or doing. And I think it was, you know, a bit uncomfortable. I think it's still very uncomfortable, but I feel like people are much more willing to engage in a much more reflexive, much more, thoughtful process of image making. And I, you know, I think really in the past year, since the murder of George Floyd, I think, you know, people are questioning their own positionality in a way that had not previously been questioned. And I think that's really important. So absolutely, I think that this is only gaining momentum and only gaining steam for people to be reflecting on this. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here to have this conversation. And I'm really grateful for all the work that you're doing. Alice and Catherine, I think that, you know, this is a fantastic series, and it's great to see more initiatives.
To you, and we'll share. I'll write to the participant afterwards, and I'll share the website and your details. It's actually still a good question that maybe very briefly, how do you avoid stereotypical photograph across cultures and history? Because as outsider, you know, we have stereotypes in mind, or how do you break those stereotypes? And let's just make it quick.
Okay, quickly. I think one thing is to really educate yourself about how that place has been photographed previously, and be aware of maybe what stereotypes there are, so that you aren't unwittingly or unconsciously replicating them. I think also working with people who are local to that area, speaking with them about maybe what things are important to them that people see, you know, what are important considerations. I think as many conversations you can have with people who are there and who are living that experience can only strengthen your work if you're working in another place.
Excellent. Thank you, Savannah. And just to remind people that this is part of a photo ethics and development research series. So if you'd like to join, just email me. Catherine just posted my email, and you'll be receiving an email from me very shortly. The recordings will be made available, so feel free to share it, and do check the Photography Ethics Center website. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Savannah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.